I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time, who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access. Rick Cleveland has been writing about sports for 57 years. Yes, you heard me right. 57 years. And Rick's still writing. It's literally in his blood. His father was a sports writer. His son is a sports writer. And no sports writer in the state of Mississippi can match the career of Rick Cleveland. Not that he'd say it. He's too much of a Southern gentleman, as you'll hear in this episode. And you'll hear a guy who flat out knows how to tell a story. Tell it in a way that makes everything else just fade softly away. You'll feel like you're sipping sweet tea in a rocker on a porch. Enjoy. Rick, you've walked into this Press Box Access Tavern fully warned. Thank you for coming anyway.
I'm looking forward to it, Todd.
I've
enjoyed the episodes I've listened to. It's a great idea and a great concept.
Well, thank you. Thank you. My payment should be coming through to your Venmo at any moment. I'm very happy you've joined us. Any friend of Tom Archdeacon is welcomed here, so thank you.
Arch is the best, one of the dearest souls I've ever met.
Yeah, he was one of our very first few guests, and Arch kept saying to me, you have to have Rick on. So here we go. We got Rick, and you walked in here with credentials that few sports writers can match, certainly down south, no question in the state of Mississippi. Rick, unprecedented 14-time winner, Sports Writer of the Year in Mississippi. Hell, I feel like I'm talking to William Faulkner.
You know, somebody said the other day when they announced this year that boy, your daddy, who was a sports writer, would really be proud of you. And I said, yeah, he'd be really proud. He'd say, what happened those other 43 years?
That's right, right? Yeah. Win something, then you got to keep repeating it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you've been writing about sports for 57 years. That's just amazing to me. When you think about it, when somebody says 57 years of covering sports, what do you think of?
Well, one thing I think of is that, you know, back when I started in Mississippi, it was segregated.
Right.
I mean, there were white teams and black teams. There weren't mixed teams. And, women didn't play much of anything. You know, there were no women's sports to speak of. Small towns had women's basketball, girls' basketball teams, but there was no college basketball or anything like that. So those have been and of course, television has changed everything. But what was it like as a young white guy to come into a segregated sports world like that in Mississippi? You know, I had grown up here, so it was just the way things were. I remember thinking to myself, why are they this way? You know, but that's the way things were. I remember my daddy. I grew up in Hattiesburg, and the high schools were segregated. But my daddy would take me on Friday nights over across town. Actually, it was on Thursday nights. The Rowan High was the black school in Hattiesburg, and we'd go, and they never lost, by the way. They never lost. They just won every game, and they usually won by 55-0. And I remember my daddy taking me, and they'd had a special little section roped off there where the white people sat. And I just remember thinking, golly, these people are having a lot more fun than the other school I go look at, go watch their games. And we would go watch the black semi-pro team. It was the Hattiesburg Black Sox, and we'd go watch them play. And then, I was, when the schools desegregated in Mississippi was around the late 60s, and one of the first guys that I covered was Walter Payton. I grew up in Hattiesburg. He was in Columbia, which was 26 miles away.
Wow.
And he was on the first integrated team at Columbia High. It's amazing when you think about it, Todd, that, this is really half a century removed from that.
Yeah, I think sometimes we think about history in regards to, that was a long time ago, but no, it wasn't. No, it wasn't at all.
No, it wasn't that long ago at all,
Right. Did being a sportswriter open your eyes to the world? And do you think sports played a part in helping make it a better world, especially in the South?
In Mississippi, there's no question about it. I can't imagine what desegregation would have been like in a lot of small towns in Mississippi if it hadn't been for sports. Because, let's face it, Todd, they're down there on the field. I mean, you're watching it, and you're seeing black kids and white kids play together and work together and be better for it.
Right.
I mean, it's you can't miss it. It's happening right in front of you. So, yeah, it was quite something. And we just in the last year, Mississippi changed its state flag, got rid of the Confederate battle flag, which is always there in the corner of the state flag. And to be honest with you, it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for sports. That was what put the flag issue over the hump was, black players coming out and saying they're not going to play if that flag's flying at the stadium. The SEC is saying we're not going to hold any of our championship things in Mississippi if you don't change that flag.
Right.
And then right on about the week before they were having the vote on it in the state legislature, every coach and athletic director at Mississippi colleges came to the legislature, and they had a press conference right there on the floor of the legislature saying, we got to change this flag. And it happened.
Right.
I mean,
like you said,
only about 100 years too late, but it happened.
Yeah, right?
Yeah,
right?
Pretty crazy.
Well, I think about that because sometimes people think, sports writers, sports in general, it's just a toy department. But it really is such a part of the culture of the society that we live in that it's intertwined with history, especially in something like race relations.
Absolutely. And there might be other states where sports are more entwined in the culture of the state, but I'm not aware of.
Right.
In Mississippi, the games that we play and go to are an incredibly important part of our culture.
Well, let's talk about this. So you're age 13 when you first start. Now, this is a family affair for you, sports writing. I mean, you're still writing at Mississippi Today as a sports columnist and sports editor, and you co-host Crooked Letter Sports podcast with your son, Tyler, who's also a sports writer. And your father, as you mentioned, Ace Cleveland, was a longtime sports writer, and then for 33 years, the final 33 of his career, he was a sports information director at Southern Mississippi. So sports, you grew up with this.
I grew up actually from the time I was 3 until the time I was 7. My mother and father were the proctors of the athletic dormitory.
Oh, you know all the secrets.
It was, yeah. My babysitters were the jocks. I learned a lot of words I wasn't supposed to know at age 5. Yeah. So, in my backyard was the football stadium. The dormitory was actually underneath the stadium, like it is at Tiger Stadium in Baton Rouge.
So you were running around in the press box as a kid. Did you just take a liking for the writers, and what was that like? Was it magical for you?
Oh yeah, I mean, they and after the games, all the writers would come to our house, and my dad would have a little party for them, and they'd discuss their stories, and of course I'd watch the same game, so I was real interested in that, and. What I found, Todd, my doctor and the plumbers that came to the house, and they didn't seem to be having nearly as much fun as those sports writers
Yeah,
did.
exactly, right?
Yeah, so, I guess I was like 12 years old when I told my dad that's what I wanted to do. I've decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to be a sports writer.
At age 13, tell us a story about your first assignment and how did it go? What was it?
Okay. Well, first, when I was 12 and told Dad this, he said, you're going to have to learn to type. You got to type. And so I was 12 years old and I was about 3 feet 8. And I take typing in a summer school course at the university. I audit the class and go in and take typing so I'll know how to type. But my first assignment was actually a game between Brooklyn High School, about 20 miles south of Hattiesburg, and Lucedale High School, about 50 miles southeast of Hattiesburg. And it was at Lucedale. And, of course, I don't have a driver's license. I can't ride my bicycle 50 miles. So my dad drives me down there, and I cover the game, come back to the house, sit down at his typewriter at my kitchen table, at our kitchen table, and he leaves the room, and about 30 minutes later, he comes back in, and that white sheet of paper is still clean and white. He said something I probably shouldn't say on.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
He said, well, shit, son, what the hell's going on? And I said, Dad, I can't get started. I don't know where to start. And he gave me right then some of the best advice I've ever gotten as a writer. He said, well, son, if I was you, I'd start writing it the way I'd tell it.
Yeah.
And I did, and it damn sure wouldn't have won any awards, but I got a byline in the next day's Hattiesburg American, and nobody got libeled or, there were no 4-letter words in it. Everything was I could spell. To be honest with you, Todd, at that point at the Hattiesburg American, the qualifications you had to have to write sports were you had to be able to type and breathe.
Well, and I got to say,
both.
that's probably the qualifications at a lot of places over the years.
Yeah, and people ask me, what'd you make for those games? And I think I was making, it was either $5 or $10 a game.
Hey.
But hell, at 12, 13, at 13, that was,
That's a lot of baseball cards you can buy and put in the
that's exactly right.
Spokes of your bicycle wheels.
A lot of milkshakes at that time.
Well, byline at age 13, you certainly learned how to do it. At the Hattiesburg American, you went on to the Jackson Daily News, and then long time at the Clarion Ledger in Jackson as sports editor and columnist. And we're going to talk a lot about your home state, Mississippi, as we already have. But sports writing, as you said, it opened your eyes to the world around you, but it also took you a lot of places. Took you out of the state. You went to 29 Super Bowls, I believe. Olympics, Masters, U.S. Open. When you think about some of the places you've been, one place that I wanted to ask you about was the Masters. I wanted to ask you about one particular year, and that's 1997, when Tiger Woods, the young Tiger Woods, won the Masters for the first time. And I bring this up because we talked a little bit about, the racial history of the South and sports. Tiger goes into Augusta, Georgia, and just wins as a young guy, just destroys the field.
Yeah.
What was that like to cover that event, being a Southern writer and knowing the history and of not just the South, but Augusta and just what Tiger did as a player, knowing the course that you did?
Well, it was truly amazing. But I got to tell you, Todd, and I can't remember what year it was, but I was there the year Lee Elder was the first black man to play in the Masters. And that was what was really, to me, it's the guys like Lee Elder and Pete Brown, who's from Jackson, Mississippi, and was the first African-American to win on the tour. those were the guys that I was thinking about when Tiger won by 12 shots. I was thinking about those guys who did it first, you know, and you know, I got to know Pete Brown later on. He had gotten his start caddying at a club that's a few miles from where I live. And when he started playing golf, he had a 5-iron and a 3-wood, and one of them was a right-handed club, and one of them was a left-handed club.
That's how he learned the game. Wow.
Yeah, that's how he learned the game. And
then he went on to win on the PGA Tour. Wow.
He beat, gosh, who was it he beat? He beat a really great player in a playoff to win the San Diego Open. I think 1967. Yeah. My memory may be a little bit off, but it was in there. And, you know, and back then it was, I think first prize was like $5,000, which seems like peanuts now. But at that time, I remember talking to his wife when he went into the Mississippi Sports Hall of Fame posthumously and posthumously, and his wife said, "You can't believe what that meant." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I could pay the rent."
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So those are those are the people and the anecdotes that you thought of when Tiger comes in.
That's
in
what
97.
I thought of when Tiger did what he did, and I thought about all the people. I mean, I grew up in Hattiesburg, and I remember when the Magnolia Classic, which became what is now the Sanderson Farms Classic, standalone event on the PGA Tour. I mean, it's Mississippi's only PGA Tour tournament, but it was the Magnolia Classic back then, and it started in Hattiesburg. And I think Pete Brown was not only the first black guy to play in it, but was maybe the first black person that ever played the golf course.
Wow.
You know, he wouldn't have been allowed to be a member.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the kind of thing. When Tiger won, I remember thinking, you know, it was just an amazing display of golf, first of all. But I thought of those people that came before him, you know. I think I'm a lot like you in this respect. The history of sports is really what really grabs me. I mean, that's the part of it I really love, and a lot of times when I'm watching an event, I'll think about the history of what led to this, and with Tiger at that Masters, that's what I thought.
Well, I think that's what made your writing stand out, and still does, is that your ability to contextualize and put into a time frame what this means. What it goes beyond what we think we're seeing, and you're able to bring out the humanity of the past people who made this possible, or just some stories behind the scenes about people that you might not have realized. I think of somebody like when you went to the Olympics, you know, I'm thinking about the 96 Olympics, and the U.S. women's basketball team, you know, they win the gold medal. There's a lot of stories, right? But you as a Mississippi writer knew how to bring it home to your audience. And there was a player, Ruthie Bolton.
From McLean, Mississippi.
McLean, Mississippi. I think the population now is like 400. Yeah.
Well, at that time, 21 of them were named Bolton because she was one of 19 siblings. She had 18 brothers and sisters. And her father was a Baptist minister and a farmer. And I asked him, I heard his name was Linwood Bolton. I remember asking him at those Olympics, I said, "Well, you know, Miss Bolton, how were you a pastor and a farmer?" And he said, "Well, you know, I had 19 children. I had to feed them." And he said that's why he farmed, was to feed that family. And I asked Ruthie how she was the most tenacious athlete I've ever covered.
Really?
I mean, she got every loose ball. She was the heart and soul of that Olympic team. She was the point guard. And I asked her where that drive and that passion and the hustle came from. And she told me, she said, if you're one of 19 kids in your family, you better hustle or you're not going to get a piece of the fried chicken. You're not going to get the piece of chicken at dinner.
That's right. You're lucky if you get a slice of bread.
Yeah. So, but Ruthie made those Olympics for me.
It's interesting that her story has stuck with you all these years.
Well, I mean, you know, again, I've covered 29 Super Bowls, and I don't remember one where there wasn't a Mississippi guy that was a big part of. You know, we've had. Yeah,
let's talk about this. You know, you mentioned Walter Payton. You think about so many great athletes that came out of Mississippi. Mississippi doesn't, you know, it's not a huge population state, but when you think about the athletes and coaches, especially it's NFL, amazing. Walter Payton, Jerry Rice, Brett Favre, Archie Manning, Steve McNair, Lance Alworth. I mean, you can go on and on. I mean, not just great players. These were Peyton, Rice, Favre, and Manning, McNair. Those are some of the biggest names to ever play in the NFL.
Yeah, you know, at one time you had Walter Payton was the leading rusher in NFL history. At one time, Brett Favre was the leading passer in NFL history. Jerry Rice, the leading pass receiver and touchdown scorer in NFL history. And Steve McNair was the total offense leader in the history of NCAA football at one time. All those guys are from towns in Mississippi of fewer than 7,000 people. Wow. There's all small town Mississippi guys.
So what is it? What is it about those small town guys that when you think about their backgrounds and then where they go on to become, you know, the pantheon of NFL players, what was it about their roots in Mississippi that you think drove them?
I've had this discussion with Archie Manning, who's from Drew, Mississippi, and he's got to be the patriarch of the first family of Mississippi of football in the United States. I mean, you know, Archie Manning. Yeah. And I've talked to him about it, and he thinks it's because of just how important and what a huge part of the fabric of small-town Mississippi high school football is. Hey. You know, the kids, I mean, you do two things. You go to high school football games on Friday night, and you go to church on Sunday morning. Hey. And that's the two big things in small-town Mississippi. And, well, there's deer hunting on Saturday. And you know, like it's like Archie said, you grow up going to the games, and it's the big thing in town. Everybody goes to the games, and you grow up dreaming of being one of those guys out there playing. And you know, I don't know. You know, Nolan Richardson, you know, famously said, "Well, where do you think the slave ships landed?" That. We also had Lance Alworth and Brett Favre, and you know, a lot of really great white football players came from Mississippi too. Right. It is a huge part of the social fabric of Mississippi is high school football, and I think that has a lot to do. You
mentioned Walter Payton in high school. Do you remember your first memory seeing Walter as a reporter?
You know, Columbia was on the outskirts of our high school coverage, so we had a stringer over there who called in the reports of all the little high schools in Marion County, which is about 30 miles, and the woman's name was Eva B. Beats. And every Friday night, I would get the calls from her, and she always asked for me, and she called me Ricky, and she said, "Ricky?" And she always started like this. She said, "Ricky, you ain't going to believe what that Payton boy did tonight." And I'll never forget that. And on the last game of his senior season, she said that she started it out that way. And then she said, Walter scored 7 touchdowns, and on the last one, he ran the last 35 yards backwards.
Really? That's spectacular.
Yeah, and that's also why none of the three Division I predominantly historically white universities didn't recruit him. It was at the cusp of integration in Mississippi. And, they didn't want a black person that was going to run the last 35 yards backwards.
It was held against him, right?
Yeah. He only scored 464 points at Jackson State. Think about that. The other thing about Walter that people, particularly now, because we're getting, a few decades removed from when he played, but Walter not only was a great runner, he's one of the greatest blockers I ever saw. I mean, he didn't just block the edge rushers. He hurt them. I mean, he was something. Now, I remember his agent. His agent was a Hattiesburg attorney named Bud Holmes. And he called me at the Hattiesburg American one day and said, well, they're having pro day up at Jackson State. You want to ride up there with me? And I said, sure, I'll ride up there with you. And back then, this is 1972 or 3. And, the football was integrated in Mississippi. I mean, State, Ole Miss, Southern Miss all had black players, but they only had 3 or 4.
Right.
And Jackson State, on their senior day, there were 24 prospects.
Wow.
24 pro prospects that had to run the 40. Well, of course, and 2 of the top 6 draft picks were from Jackson State, Walter and Robert Brazile, another NFL
great player for the Oilers,
Hall of
right?
Fame. Yeah. So there are 24 people lined up ready to run the 40-yard dash, and Walter goes first. And he knocks off about 3 40-yard dashes, and then he goes over and sits on his helmet and watches the other guys do it. And then they finish, and they're about to move to the next thing, and Walter said, you hear that high-pitched voice of his said, hey, y'all, watch this. And he gets down in the 40-yard dash, and then at the start of the 40-yard dash, gets in a handstand, and handstands 40 yards. And, I tell this story a lot.
Wait a minute, explain this. I got to visually think about this.
He gets on his hands and handstands the 40 yards.
He never rose up to run? He just handstands?
I'm talking about he's erect. Doing a handstand. I mean, he's not on his knees. He never gets up. he handstands 40 yards.
Oh, my God.
And I tell that story a lot when I'm doing speaking engagements, and people say, invariably they say, well, what was his time? And I said, hell, I don't know what his time was, but it was a world record.
Yeah, right.
I'd tell you that, because ain't nobody else can do it.
Oh, my Lord, I've never heard of such a thing.
He was just amazing. Walter, when he signed his first contract with the Bears, you probably couldn't do this these days, but at that time, his agent, Bud Holmes, had a Learjet in Hattiesburg, and he said, do you want to ride up there for the contract signing? And I said, well, who's on the plane? He said, well, it'll be me, you, the pilot, and his mama, Walter's mama, the sweetest lady who ever lived. And Eileen Payton was her name. And I said, sure. And she had never been in an airplane before. And I remember I held her hand taking off and landing because she was scared, frightened to death. And so I knew Walter pretty well in the Super Bowl in New Orleans at the Superdome.
When the Bears beat the Patriots,
And I'll never forgive Ditka for not giving him the ball there and letting him score the touchdown instead of the 330-pound nose tackle.
Yeah, knowing Walter the way you did, do you think that really bothered Walter that he didn't get a chance to score a touchdown?
It bothered the hell out of him. He at first he wouldn't come out for the press conference.
Yeah.
In fact, Bud Holmes had to go in to the locker room and talk him into coming out and doing the post-game press conference. Yeah.
Well, you think about his career began with slights, right? I mean, he was fighting from the very beginning, coming out of high school, and here it is in the Super Bowl, the greatest moment for the Bears and for his own career, and they choose not to give him the ball on the goal line to score a touchdown.
And people forget that early in his career, they were terrible.
Right.
I remember it was either his rookie year or his second season. I was in Chicago at Soldier Field, and in the rushing race came down to, seems like it was him and OJ.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. Yeah.
And he sprained an ankle in the early in the game and didn't get enough yards, and he finished second in the NFL rushing run on a team that won like 2 or 3 games.
Right.
Those were some bad Bear teams he played on early in his career.
Right.
He's the best all-around football player I've ever seen. People don't know this, but he punted and kicked off and kicked extra points at Jackson State.
Wow.
I think he threw 6 or 7 touchdown passes with the Bears. I mean, he could really throw the ball too. And like I say, he was the best blocker ever. I can't imagine how good a strong safety he would have been if he'd played on the other side of the ball. He's just a fabulous player who worked harder at it than anybody else.
Uh-huh.
Archie Manning told me one time they got together in Jackson and he was going to try to do Peyton's off-season workout with him. And Archie said, I lasted 10 minutes. He said, I was throwing up after 10 minutes.
Well, that's what sets the greatness of sweetness apart, right? Walter was running up those hills with that chip on his shoulder to show everybody.
Yeah, up the levee at the Pearl River, which runs right through Jackson. Yeah.
You think about it, Peyton, Rice, Archie Manning, McNair. You mentioned Brett Favre. He goes on to this career where he becomes, this legendary player. He was kind of like, John Madden's toy, Madden loved Favre, and Favre became this guy. But you knew him back when he was just a kid, growing up. Did you think Brett Favre was ever going to become who Brett Favre became?
I had heard, I didn't really cover him in high school or anything. Nobody knew who he was. He played for his dad down on the coast, which is a good ways. Mississippi's a long state. We're right in the middle. He was way down at the bottom. And he didn't make All-State or anything like that because his dad was his coach, and they ran the wing tee.
Oh.
So he either ran or handed the ball off. I think he averaged 4 passes a game his senior year of high school.
Really? I never knew that. Wow.
The day before National Signing Day, his senior year in high school, he thought he was going to Delta State, which is a Division II school in Mississippi. He had no Division I offers. And then Southern Miss lost a quarterback. Somebody that had committed to them got an offer from Alabama, and that opened up a scholarship at Southern Miss. And the coach called and offered him the scholarship, and he took it. The reason he got number 4, the reason he always wore number 4 is when he got to Southern, he's going through the line and to get assigned their jersey, and they said, "What number you want?" He said, "Well, I wore 10 in high school. I'd love to have number 10." And they said, "You can't have that one because Reggie Collier wore that. He was a great quarterback at Southern Miss, and the jersey had been retired." And he said, "Well, how about 12? Roger Staubach was one of my favorite players." He said, "Can't have 12, but somebody's already got it." And he said, "Well, what about 18? I loved Archie Manning." And he said, "Can't have 18 either, and that's already taken." He said, "Well, what's available for a quarterback?" And they said, "Well, there's 4. He said, "I'll take it." That's how he became number 4.
and stayed number 4.
Stayed number 4. Yeah. He was, when first time I covered him, Southern Miss was playing a home game against Tulane. They're down by 2 touchdowns at halftime. They had planned to redshirt him because, he really hadn't. He had run the wing T. It was totally different than what they were running at the time. And so they were going to redshirt him, but it was desperate. I mean, they were not very good, and they were getting beat at home by Tulane by 2 touchdowns. And in the third quarter, the head coach, whose name was Jim Carmody, said, "All right, we're going to play. Well, we ain't got anything to lose. We're going to have to throw the ball to win this game, and he's the strongest arm we got." So they put him in. Todd, the first time he goes back in the pocket, he throws a button hook pattern to a receiver. I think he was a slot receiver. And the guy turned around, and the ball, embedded in his stomach.
What?
Knocked the
like a cartoon?
Yeah, I mean, it hurt. You could see him visibly get knocked back by the football. And he throws 2 touchdowns and runs for another one, and they come from behind and beat Tulane. The next week they played Texas A&M, and he's the starter, And at that point in his career, he couldn't do anything except throw fastballs. I mean, he just threw it so hard. The receivers, you go down there, and the receivers, you'd be interviewing them, and that commercial they did where where the receivers all have crooked fingers that look deformed in there. It was true. I mean, they really were.
He was busting digits.
Yeah, and he covered. I remember covering a game when they played at East Carolina, and he leads them down the field. They're behind with 2 minutes to go, get the ball inside their own 10, and he leads them down the field, and they score. But he threw one. I was down on the field already to do the post-game interviews, and so I'm watching from the sideline, and he throws this 45-yard pass that never gets more than 8 feet off the ground. I mean, it's just a bullet, 45 yards across the field. And the receiver turned around just as the ball got there and caught it and goes out of bounds inside the 5-yard line. And everybody was talking to Favre after the game, and I went and talked to the receiver, little bitty guy. And I said, "Alfred, how did you know?" What I want to know is how you knew to turn around and catch that ball. He said, "Because I heard it." I said, "What?" He said, "No, I heard the football coming." And I said, "Oh, come on, Alfred, tell me the truth." And he said, "No, you can always hear Brett's passes coming."
Wow.
He said, I mean, have you ever heard such? I mean, I had never heard of anything like that at the time. His passes actually whistled through the wind.
Wow. Well, that might explain why he became one of the all-time great quarterbacks in NFL history. And, and it's unfortunate that, lately Brett's been in the news for a lot of bad things, with the news about the welfare agency that he's been seeking money from and all this. You've known Favre forever. What do you think about some of what's going on with an NFL legend like that now?
Well, I'm really disappointed in it. That's the only way to put it. I'm really, really disappointed. It's my organization, Mississippi Today, that's been on the forefront of breaking all that news. So we have a reporter named Anna Wolf who's just done an amazing job.
Yeah, he's been seeking millions of dollars from the Mississippi Welfare Agency to fund a new football facility at Southern Miss, a volleyball arena. It's been big news down in your home.
Yeah, it's all I can say about it is I'm very, very disappointed in it.
Yeah. Well, one quarterback that's legendary in Mississippi who has an unimpeached reputation is Archie Manning. And you mentioned Archie. And Archie, obviously the father of Peyton and Eli. But, young folks might not realize Archie was such a great quarterback himself. He went on to play for the New Orleans Saints for 10 years, 71 to 81, and really got his ass beaten on a bunch of bad teams. And yet was a heck of a player. I mean, he was NFC Player of the Year in 1978 on a losing team.
79, and he's NFC Player of the Year.
Yeah.
But I remember talking to Roger Staubach, and Archie and Roger Staubach played a lot alike. They threw on the run a lot, and both were great athletes, not just great quarterbacks, but great athletes. And I asked Roger, I said, what was the difference between you and, a Pro Football Hall of Famer that won Super Bowls and everything, and Archie? And he said, just luck. He said, I played for Dallas, one coach my whole career. Archie played for the New Orleans Saints. I don't even know how many coaches he had. I mean, there were times, Archie tells a great story about being in the huddle, and at that time that they used tight ends to send in the plays with, and tight end comes in the huddle and gives Archie the play and says, Archie said, wait a second, who are you? The Saints had signed him the day before. He didn't even know him.
Oh.
But I tell you what, of all the people I've ever covered, Archie Manning is the best human being. And the way his sons are, it's a direct reflection of the way Archie and Olivia Manning raised him.
Well, Archie, his legend began back in college, 68, 69, 70 at Ole Miss. I mean,
at Ole Miss.
I mean, they wrote songs about the man, the Ballad of Archie Who.
Yeah, the Ballad of Archie Who. It was #1. I mean, if you couldn't turn on a radio station in 1969 in Mississippi and not hear the Ballad of Archie Who.
Do you know any of the lyrics still?
I remember it was the way it finished was the best rootin' tootin' quarterback who ever played the game.
That's a pretty good finish to a song.
Yeah, well, he was an amazing player to watch. I mean, he finished third in the Heisman Trophy voting his senior season, and he missed 3 games with a broken arm.
Right. He played the Sugar Bowl with a broken arm, right?
He played, actually, it was the Gator Bowl that year. Yeah. They played Auburn, and he hadn't played. Well, he actually played against LSU. They tried to play him against LSU, and he had a cast on his arm. He played with a cast. And then he played in the Gator Bowl, and I think Auburn won the game 35-28, but he was fabulous. He was the MVP in the Sugar Bowl as a sophomore at Ole Miss. He was a great player on an otherwise fairly mediocre team.
You mentioned him as being one of your all-time favorites. obviously a great player, but what made him so special to you as a writer, reporter over the years, the working relationship that you had with Archie and still have?
I'll give you one story that encapsulates the way why I feel the way I do about Archie. Is that this is at the end of his career. He's already, he spent all those years getting beat up with the Saints, and then they trade him to Houston. He gets beat up there, and they trade him to Minnesota. And they're terrible. The Vikings are terrible. This is, what would this be? This would be like 83, 84.
Uh-huh.
They weren't very good. Les Steckel was the head coach, and Wade Wilson was actually his starting quarterback. Hey. But I remember they're playing a Thursday night game, and I remember getting home from work and turning it on and just, hoping that Archie might get a chance. They might get so far behind that he gets a chance to play, and that's exactly what happened. They're behind 31-0 at halftime, and they put Archie in the game. They put Archie in the game, I think, because they were afraid Wade Wilson was going to get killed.
Let's put the stunt double in.
Archie, yeah. So they put Archie in, and he just turns back the clock. I mean, he's scrambling all over the field, throwing darts. They end up losing, but he made it a one-score game in the fourth quarter. And I had already written a column for the next day's paper. But I called him in and said, I'm rewriting. We'll save the other one. I'm going to rewrite about Archie. And I wrote a column about basically about him turning back the clock after all these years. And so the next afternoon, I'm in my office at the Clarion Ledger, and about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the phone rings. And I recognized the voice immediately. It was Archie. And he was calling from Minneapolis. And I said, Archie, what's going on, man? He said, I just calling to thank you. And I said, for what? He said, for the column you wrote in today's Jackson Daily News. And I said, well, we got a pretty good circulation in Mississippi, but we don't circulate much in Minneapolis. And and this was before the internet.
Right.
He said, and I said, how do you know about it? He said, because my mama called me and read me every word of it.
Wow.
And, let's face it, Todd, you've done what I do. I mean, you don't get many calls like that from professional athletes. That's Archie in a nutshell. There's so many stories that never get out about things that he's done behind the scenes for people, kids that are dying and stuff like that. He's not doing it. He doesn't want it ever to be publicized. He's just doing it because he's basically doing it because that's the way he'd want to be treated if it was him,
We've talked a lot of NFL and these great stars that have come out of Mississippi. And as we wrap this up, we'd be very remiss to not talk a little bit about college football. And I wanted to ask you specifically about the Ole Miss Mississippi State rivalry, the Egg Bowl, as it is known. Now, there's a lot of great rivalries in sports, especially in college football. You think Ohio State, Michigan, Alabama, Auburn, throughout the country. Now, the one down in Mississippi might not get as much national pub all the time, but tell us about what it's been like to cover that rivalry, which began in 1901, and why is it so fierce?
Well, the rivalry predates football. I mean, Ole Miss was what you call the flagship Mississippi University, created in 1848. And it was resented, and it was considered a school for the rich people, the planters, Delta planters, the plantation owners. So Mississippi State was created basically for another class of people. You know, they always thought that Ole Miss was the favored university. Mississippi State's created. There's a resentment before there was even a sport of football.
So it's in the DNA of the rivalry. It's baked right in there.
And so, right. And so when football gave them a way to like legally fight,
and they have, right?
Yeah, and they have.
I mean, the whole idea of the Egg Bowl comes from like the
Egg Bowl trophy, which was created after
1926, the brawl.
Yeah, Ole Miss wins a game at Starkville. They're about to tear down the goalposts, and people come out and start beating them with folding chairs and stuff,
like pro wrestling.
And so the student bodies got together and created an Egg Bowl trophy that maybe they could present instead of having the goalpost torn down.
The Golden Egg Trophy, they called it, the Golden Egg.
Yeah, and it became the Egg Bowl. What's really interesting, especially for this show, is the reason the Egg Bowl is called the Egg Bowl is because Tom Patterson, do you know who I'm talking about? Sports editor. Yeah, who later was with the National. He spent time in Atlanta and Denver, but he was the sports editor of the Clarion Ledger and Jackson Daily News, and he had put together his staff. He had a staff of 27 sports writers, and we were winning all kinds of national APSC awards, but we couldn't win special section because our teams wouldn't go to a big event. You know, they weren't good enough to go to a big event. They weren't going to bowl games, so Tom decided to create his own bowl, and he started calling the Battle for the Golden Egg the Egg Bowl. And we would cover that game and put out a special section. I mean, we'd have 12 writers and 8 photographers.
Wow, it was like your Super Bowl, right?
It was, and I remember the first year I was at the Clarion Ledger was in 1979. And I was the Mississippi State beat writer. It was Emory Billard's first season as the head coach at Mississippi State. And I had 2 assignments that game. I covered the first quarter. My assignment was to write 800 words on the first quarter. We didn't just do a game story. We did quarter story.
Oh, my Lord.
My first, and I'm writing. I've got 800 words on the first quarter, and guess what the score was at the end of the first quarter?
0-0.
0-0. And my other side...
Wait a minute. Lincoln said 280 words at Gettysburg. You had to do 800 words on a 0-0 first quarter. 800 words on a
scoreless first quarter, yeah. And in my other assignment, I had to do a sidebar. I had to follow the Bulldog mascot, and another poor guy had to cover Colonel Rebel, the Ole Miss Rebel
the
mascot.
mascot beat.
Yeah, I had the mascot. But, well, it's still the Egg Bowl, and it did win first place in the APSC contest that year. So Patterson got... God rest his soul.
I think it was those scintillating 800 words about a 0-0 first quarter, Rick.
I don't think anybody read it. I'll be honest with you.
Well, as an old sports writer in Cincinnati once told me, they can make you write it, but they can't make you read it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. But that's the way the Egg Bowl became the Egg Bowl, and it's still, there's controversy just about every year. It was 2 years ago, the game was decided when the Ole Miss players scored a touchdown in the last few seconds and acted like a dog peeing in the end zone. They get a 15-yard penalty, They get a 15-yard penalty. All they got to do is kick the extra point to tie the game, send it into overtime. Well, they get a 15-yard penalty, and it becomes a 37-yard field goal, and he misses it.
That's one of my favorite touchdown celebrations of all time.
That's how Lane Kiffin got to Oxford. The Ole Miss coach got fired because of that game. I mean, that was the last straw. And if they'd have won the game, he'd have kept his job.
Well, I think imitating having one of your players imitate a dog urinating in the end zone might be the last straw.
Well, yeah, and it did. It got him fired, and so now Lane Kiffin's the head coach.
Changed college football history. Sent Lane to Ole Miss.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I'll tell you what, Rick, this has been a treasure trove of great stories from down south, and it's been so much fun. There's so many other ones I wanted to hit you up on, but we had some great memories come forth here. I really appreciate this. It's been a lot of fun just chatting with you about some of the athletes and stories and events that you covered in an amazing career, 57 years.
Well, I appreciate it, Titus. Almost all we needed was a beer, and it'd been like we were sitting in a bar telling stories.
And we will get that beer sometime, Rick, down the road. We thank you for spending time with us and wish you all the best.
Great, buddy. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Press Box Access. You can find us here with a new episode every other Wednesday. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. Drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcome here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcast. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Bill Hoffman, and our audio engineer Nathan Corson. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Warriors in Their Own Words, a podcast that presents the unvarnished, unsanitized truth of what we have asked of those who defend this nation. As a country, we need these stories more than ever. Stories from Americans who have borne the battle, including 30-year-old remastered interviews with veterans from World War I recounting their time in the trenches of Europe, and with veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and from our most recent conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other battlefields Americans may never have heard of. Hear their stories by listening to Warriors in Their Own Words wherever you find podcasts.